In this next section, we're going to look at life history theory. This is an important theoretical framework that we need to use to understand how disease mechanisms might unfold over the lifetime of an individual. And this is also a very important theory in order to come back to the example with the access to clean water in rural villages in Ethiopia. Life history theory is a very prominent theory in psychology, but also specifically in biology, which has been growing exponentially over the last couple of years. So here is a graph that shows the number of publications over the last couple of years, and as you can see, it has become a very popular theory because it is quite useful for explaining a number of different phenomena. Here are some of the core assumptions of life history theory. I already implicitly talked about the idea of trade-offs. Life history theory assumes that energy is finite and our bodies need to decide where to distribute energy at any particular point in time. So the energy that we have as bodies that we get through our nutrition needs to be allocated to specific tasks, and our body needs to decide where to put the energy. From an evolutionary perspective, there are a couple of competing functions. We can use energy to just maintain our body, we can use energy to grow our body, we can use energy to reproduce, to pass on our genes, or we can use energy to defend our body in various different ways. And now the important issue is that because energy is limited, our body has to make decisions where to put the energy. Maintaining our body just alive, growing our body, putting emphasis into reproduction, or defending against internal or external threats. And the important issue is that from an evolutionary perspective, the most important function amongst all of these is actually reproduction. Right? So if anything else is held constant, our body typically will try and focus on increasing the reproductive value, so maximizing reproductive success. So this is a core assumption of life history theory. The interesting thing is that life history theory is actually probably at least two major sets of theories. Here is a chart that shows all these different theories or micro theories and publications prior to 2010, and what you can see is it's a relatively coherent cluster of studies that are nicely citing each other. And what happens after 2010 is we start seeing this kind of bifurcation where we have a continuing cluster in biology, but in psychology the life history literature becomes somewhat distinct. And so we need to quickly talk about the different understandings of life history theory in biology compared to psychology. In biology, life history theory focuses on selection and how selection within environments happens on specific life history traits. So how bodies act on, or distribute the energy that is available to these different functions like maintenance, growth, reproduction, or defense. All right, so bodies can make different choices, and selection now happens and selects those individuals and groups that solve that problem in the most efficient way. So it works at the population level and maximizes fitness at the population level, right? So which animal or which groups of animals solve that energy problem in the most efficient way. And so over time what we will see is as groups of individuals move into different ecologies or have different demographic compositions, They will produce different life histories because they adapt to these environments in slightly different ways. So the distribution of energy happens slightly differently, trying to balance these different functions. And so over time, we will see the emergence of new species. So this is the classic example where we have these selection mechanisms that we talked about right at the beginning of the term. And the important point here is that there is variation around the mean, but there's no real claim about adaptation of individuals to personal environments. So everything in evolutionary biology that happens in relation to life history theory is focused on the population and looks at population distributions of life history traits and how individuals within that population manage the distribution of energy to meet the demands of the local environment. In psychology, people have started taking a slightly different perspective. We still have the trade-offs, we still have the idea of limited energy that needs to be distributed, but now the idea is that change happens over the lifetime of an individual, and depending on the environment that an individual is in, different strategies for the individual become more or less adaptive. So this is where plasticity, the idea of plasticity, of adapting to the local environment and responding to these ecological conditions, becomes really, really important. And so with the idea that there is limited energy, if you are in an environment that has relatively high mortality, so you have a low chance of reaching maturity and having a relatively low chance of passing on your genes, so short lifespan, your body is better off to put a lot of emphasis into rapid growth, early maturation, so you reach sexual maturation relatively fast. You invest into rapid growth, but you don't grow as strong or tall body. You have a reduced body size because there is high mortality and you have limited opportunities for getting food or getting mates. There's increased risk taking. Individuals now, because there's early maturity, invest more in many different offsprings because mortality is high, so you're better off actually passing on your genes widely, both for males and for females, having kids early, having many kids, and therefore having many offspring. You typically have in other biological systems, you have relatively small offspring size. Kids are likely to die young, and there's also rapid aging, right? So, and what happens over this, what is called fast life history, fast because there's rapid growth, fast maturation, fast passing on of your genes. Over few generations, you have lots of offspring, and only some of them will survive and again pass on their genes. So that's why it's called fast life history. On the other hand, in situations with relatively low mortality, so there's less scarcity, the environment is more predictable, there's a lower risk of dying. What happens is you have typically longer lifespans, so the body immediately gets the feeling, hold on, I actually have time, so there's slower growth. Individuals tend to mature later. Bodies become larger. There's also reduced risk taking because the resources are not as scarce, so there's less competition. Individuals invest in their offspring more, so you have fewer offspring, and you make sure that you put all your resources into your offspring to increase their chances to reach maturity. Offspring, so kids are typically slightly larger, there is lower mortality overall, and there's also slower aging overall. And so what we have here is, over generations, we have relatively few children, larger body sizes, later maturation, and fewer individuals overall, right? So these are kind of two major distinctions. Fast life history, which is thought to be more adaptive and is triggered in environments that are characterized by high mortality, and slow life history. These are typically fewer offspring, larger offspring, and they are more likely to be adaptive in environments with lower extrinsic mortality. So summarizing this, and this is really important, here the variation is really between individuals, right? So it's not so much between populations anymore, but the variation is between individuals, and we can classify individuals in terms of a fast or slow life history. So fast, early reproduction, allocation of resources towards mating efforts, slow life history, later reproduction, and devotion of resources towards slow growth and investing in your offspring. And so the idea is there are differences between individuals, and individuals adapt to their personal environments, and the important period is really childhood, because as we will see in a minute, the idea is that childhood kind of sets the parameters of the body system, and therefore acts like a forecast for later in life. The idea of developmental plasticity is important. So the strategic responses by individuals to their local environment. And what is important about the environment is the amount of harshness. So, like how threatening is the environment, how many resources are available for individuals, and also how predictable are the resources. And there are all sorts of additional predictions in the psychological version that are not shared with the biological version, that focus on, for example, risk taking, as we talked about already, delay in gratification, crime levels. So Racine, he actually talked about life history theory and how it impacts crime statistics, reward sensitivity, and various other factors, right? So this theory, this distinction between fast versus slow strategies can explain a whole host of psychological phenomena. Within biology, there's also a related theory in biology. It's typically called pace of life theory. And in biology, the idea combines both the idea of populations and individuals. So here we have the longevity, so how long do individuals live within and across populations, how many offspring do individuals have on average. So here we have lots of offspring, here we have few offspring, and so we have different populations, so we can characterize environments in terms of whether they actually allow a slow life, slow pace of life, so long life, relatively few offspring, right? So small clutches in animals, relatively slow growth, relatively shy, less aggressive, more likely to explore the environments thoroughly, right? And down here, in environments with short lifespans and with relatively high number of offspring, you have fast pace of life, so large clutches, lots of offspring, fast growth, relatively bold, relatively aggressive, and relatively superficial in exploring the environment. And we have the same gradient within populations as well as between populations. So the pace of life research tradition in biology integrates life history as we would understand it more from a evolutionary biology perspective and the more psychological life history research. So I already talked about the idea that childhood is important. Why is childhood important? Because it sets the conditions that our body first encounters as it is slowly growing, and it acts like a weather forecast. So early life effects, you can think of them as kind of a weather forecast. What is life going to be like? Should I invest resources into growing fast? Should I invest resources into maintaining my body just alive? So what is the best strategy? So our bodies very automatically scan the environment from the very first few days that we are born, and starts making adaptive decisions in terms of where to invest the incoming resources. And so really important from a life history perspective is this idea: to what extent is care available, to what extent is nutrition available, do you need to cry for extended periods of time before you get food, what is the food like, etc., etc. Our bodies really quickly and automatically make these kind of judgment calls, and then start putting the energy where it seems it is most productive. This is also sometimes called the silver spoon effect. Silver spoon because the idea is, if you have resources very early on in life, so like extensive abundant resources early on in life, this sets you up for a life that is relatively better off compared to individuals that suffer very early on malnutrition, lack of care, etc., etc. So how does that fit with some classic models? Typically, what we think about when we talk about stress and male adaptation, in psychology we often have this so-called diathesis stress model, where in negative environments people suffer, so there is an increased negative outcome. So it could be, for example, negative emotionality, and in positive environments there's a relatively low negative response and a relatively high positive response. And then we have these individuals that are relatively resilient. But the idea is really that we have stressors, environmental stressors, that put some people, push them towards more negative outcomes. What is interesting and important now from a life history perspective in this evolutionary perspective is that we have these ancestral environments that genetically adapted us to react in certain ways. So setting these kind of parameters for our bodies within which we are going to act in a certain way. And so we have an evolutionary mechanism that leads to specific possible developmental trajectories. And now, depending on the environment that our evolutionary derived bodies encounter, we will make certain allocations of energy that match this early life environment. So these cues can be, for animals it's often very important, rainfall, temperature. For humans in particular, food availability, but also temperature is quite important. But also all sorts of social environments, so the availability of care, the availability of support and protection. One thing that I already mentioned implicitly before is the types of selection that we discussed right at the beginning of the course are important for setting the parameters for these developmental mechanisms to emerge. So we will have stabilizing selection, directional selection, and diversifying, or as we called it, disruptive selection. Right? So right now, evolution sets parameters for possible developmental trajectories, and what is important now is these trajectories lead to a specific phenotype that is expressed during adulthood. And the important thing now is, what is the stability of the environment? What is called technically the temporal autocorrelation. So how similar are these environments between our early life and our adult environment? And if our adult life matches relatively closely our early life environment, then these adaptations are useful for getting our adult bodies through the environment in a more functional way. So in that case, we have an adaptive match. If the early life environment predicts the adult life environment, and therefore the phenotype that develops over the lifetime of an individual is adaptive and therefore helps the individual to survive better in that specific environment. And so here the social events, in addition to these non-social events that are really important, are competitions between individuals, the amount of males or females, which influences the mating strategies, as we have discussed when we talked about sexual selection, and the extent to which you have to cooperate or not. Right. So the important idea here is that evolution set certain parameters, and then these parameters, these developmental trajectories according to life history, are being activated by cues in our environment, which then lead to a specific behavioral adaptation, and to the extent that that early life environment is predictive of the adult life environment, so therefore there's relatively little change over the lifetime of an individual, becomes then therefore more adaptive or not. Right? And so we have additional dynamics that need to be taken into consideration during that developmental period, which leads or which is connected to these environmental stability factors, including for animals, again, for example, the fluctuations in rainfall. For humans, obviously, the important point would be in our ancestral environment, to what extent were food resources available, and how fast did food disappear, or how abundant was it over time, how predictable was it, and also, like, what are the status dynamics? Are the status dynamics changing over the lifetime of an individual? So if you are born into a very competitive environment, so fast life strategy, does that environment actually change, and then the fast life strategy becomes maladaptive in a later in life, and with that also all sorts of deceit and manipulation mechanisms. So this is the basic idea of how life history processes play out over the lifetime of an individual, and how it can happen that even though individuals made a specific forecast early on in their life, sometimes their reactions or their behavioral predispositions become maladaptive later on in life during adulthood if the environment is changing.